Hello, I'm Hazem Seeker. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, the stakes are getting higher in the oil market, and that could mean prices are going up at the pump, why Iran's nuclear deal and a host of other factors are forging a new crude reality. Also this week, a historic inter-Korean summit. But what would a peace dividend mean for the economies on the Korean peninsula? Plus, disaster recovery 3 years on from a devastating earthquake. Nepal is still struggling to rebuild. What a difference a year makes. 12 months ago, producers were worried about too much oil. But now the fear is that demand will outstrip supply. That's boosted oil prices to their highest level since 2014. The International Energy Agency says global oil demand could grow to nearly 100 million barrels a day this year. But when it comes to the price of oil in 2018, there are a number of things to consider. One of the biggest is the likelihood the US could pull out of the Iran nuclear deal next month. President Trump has until May 12th to decide whether to bring back sanctions that were eased in exchange for curbs on Tehran's nuclear program. That could keep Iranian exports of around 2 million barrels a day from flowing. Iran's President Hassan Rouhani says that would be a bad idea.
I'm telling those in the White House that if they do not live up to their commitments, the Iranian government will react firmly. If anyone betrays the deal, they should know that they would face severe consequences.
And oil output is falling in Venezuela, OPEC's biggest producer in Latin America. The political and economic turmoil there has cut crude production to around 1.5 million barrels a day. All of this is, of course, helping support oil prices. Saudi Arabia recently said it wants oil back up at $83 a barrel. And less oil from Iran or Venezuela makes it easier to keep production targets between OPEC and non-OPEC in place for longer. Now, this is something Donald Trump isn't happy about. He recently tweeted, "Looks like OPEC is at it again with record amounts of oil all over the place, including the fully loaded ships at sea. Oil prices are artificially very high, no good, and will not be accepted." Well, joining us now from Zurich is Olivier Jacob, founder, managing editor of Petromatrix. Thanks very much for being with us. So I want to ask you, first of all, about President Trump's tweet on this. When Trump says OPEC is at it again, what does he mean by that? Because surely OPEC is just doing what it's always done. Should we see this then perhaps as a warning to Saudi Arabia not to allow oil prices to run too high when Saudi wants to get the US behind them in confronting Iran?
Well, I think it's right to say that President Trump would not like the price of oil to rise too much. Now, you have to consider that about 3-4 days before the tweet from President Trump, the OECD, the IEA already said that OPEC should be watching that the prices do not rise too much and then have any negative impact on demand. So I think from the president's side, it is he does not really want to return to the the time of $100 oil that we had under Obama. The higher oil prices could start to be a concern for the consumer confidence in the U.S. And with the agenda, the geopolitical agenda in the Middle East, he also don't want prices to run too high. Before the tweet, there was a lot of talk in the press about Saudi Arabia, wanting the oil prices to be above 80 or maybe up to $100, and that would not be to the benefit of the U.S. And I think it has been the first warning given by the president to OPEC to not let the prices run too high.
And if President Trump pulls out of the Iran nuclear deal next month, as he has indicated he wants to do, then that deal collapses, what's the impact of that going to be on oil prices?
Well, I mean, it could. It should provide some support, although the impact of the sanctions will not be as large as the previous round of sanctions because the U.S. will be alone in doing them. So what you will see, you should see a shift of Iranian oil exports going more to the east. And the exports of Iran towards Asia have already started to increase. So I think Iran is probably going to discount its crude oil in order to keep the customers in Asia that are less sensible to the potential sanctions from the U.S.
Let's talk about another big oil producer, Venezuela, because the U.S. is also looking at additional measures against Venezuela's strongman, Nicolas Maduro. What are the implications of that?
Well, one could say that the sanctions are already on, in a sense, because the crude oil production from Venezuela is sharply down. It's about 1 million barrels per day less in 2016. It dropped about 500,000 barrels per day over the last 6 months. So even though there's no hard sanctions against the exports of crude oil from Venezuela, just the fear of potential sanctions, but also of the social disruptions in Venezuela means that actually right now Venezuela is suffering as much as Iran was suffering when it was under sanctions. So I think that the U.S. right now is in the best position in the sense that without hard sanctions on Venezuela, the country is already feeling the impact of it. So to add additional sanctions on top of the current drop of production and exports from Venezuela is not fully necessary, because the Venezuela by itself is restraining its revenue potential.
Does Russia want higher oil prices? That's another big producer, and they, of course, have been negotiating these targets in concert with Saudi Arabia and the OPEC nations.
I mean, Russia wants to have higher oil prices. Russia is also suffering from different sanctions imposed by the U.S. in different sectors. So Russia also benefits from the current higher oil prices, and Russia is also expanding its exports to China. So it's also expanding its market share in Asia. So for Russia right now, it is actually quite a good. They're actually in a quite good position, and it also reinforces the collaboration with OPEC and with Saudi Arabia. Also reinforces their geopolitical value and strategy in the Middle East as a whole.
Good to speak with you, Olivier Jacob, joining us there in Zurich. Now, a historic summit between the leaders of North and South Korea has raised the prospect of a formal peace treaty by the end of this year. And that could mean big investment opportunities on the peninsula. North Korea is currently under tough international sanctions, which hit its energy sector hard. The talks are also proposed between Mr. Kim and US President Trump by early June. Al Jazeera's diplomatic editor James Bays has been taking a look at life inside North Korea. We've been granted rare access to the capital, Pyongyang.
North Korea has been targeted with tougher and tougher sanctions by the US and the international community. Are they what persuaded the country's leadership to pursue a diplomatic course? And what effect are they having on ordinary people in this isolated country? We've been taken to a department store in the center of Pyongyang. Despite the international sanctions, the shelves here are full. We managed to visit a number of shops in the city centre. All were upmarket places catering to the elite. We found no shortages, and luxury items like chocolates and bottles of alcohol that were clearly smuggled in defiance of the sanctions. The official line is that foreign imports have been replaced by increased domestic production.
I don't know why others around us are starving us. Dear reporter, when you return, please tell them we are indomitable no matter what sanctions are upon us.
The only medical facility we were taken to was a gleaming new eye hospital. Most of the equipment here was imported, clearly a problem in the future when spare parts become needed. We were shown the eyeglasses, which are subsidized for North Korean citizens.
What is the name? Yes, what's the name of the North Korean brand?
Oh, our brand, you mean?
Yeah.
Not yet.
Not yet. Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet.
A recent UN report says the humanitarian situation, particularly in rural areas outside the capital, is poor. Before travelling to North Korea, I spoke to the UN's top humanitarian official in New York.
There's a nutrition problem, lots of malnourished children especially. There are too many women having really hard time, too often dying in childbirth.
It's the UN Security Council that voted in the international sanctions, and the Netherlands is the council member that administers them.
In all resolutions there's a very clear passage where it says these sanctions are not meant to have adverse negative effects on the people of DPRK.
That's the official line. Privately, even Western diplomats will tell you there's a stigma to donating humanitarian aid to North Korea. For example, an important program by the NGO, the Global Fund, to fight malaria and tuberculosis was cut earlier this year. Sanctions are having an effect in North Korea, but perhaps not the one the international community wanted.
Well, joining us now from Hong Kong is Jim McCafferty, Head of Asia Equity Research at Nomura Securities. Thanks very much for being with us. So a lot of anticipation over this North-South summit. What are the benefits of this for the North, particularly on the economic front, and why are they doing this now?
I think the reason they're doing it now is that since we've had the recent leadership in Korea since 2001, we've had not much engagement with the rest of the world, apart from a meeting in Beijing about a month ago. And I think the priorities of North Korea may be changing. It may be shifting towards economic development, and for that reason, engagement with neighbouring countries makes a great deal of sense.
Is there also a sense that the continued sanctions are starting to bite now in North Korea?
Well, they are beginning to bite, and I think be mindful that North Korea historically had depended on subsidies from Russia and China, and those subsidies were largely withdrawn back in the early 1990s, and since then North Korea has had to engage in some form of communication with Western countries to try and get some form of subsidy. Now the sanctions have been in place now for over a year, and I think it's hitting quite hard, and that's the reason perhaps that they're re-engaging with other countries.
And if you're an investor in South Korea, this has got to be a good time as well, potentially, isn't it?
Well, it may be, and as a leading player in East Asia, Nomura is looking at multiple scenarios for what might happen with North Korea. Now, I think a reunification opportunity, which the market gets quite excited about, is really a very, very small probability of that happening. What we do see as a more likely scenario is that North Korea becomes perhaps subsidized or helped by Western countries, not just South Korea, but by Japan, by China, by Russia and the United States, and goes for a denuclearization option, and with that option there might be some economic benefits that other countries can provide. And with that provision, then South Korean companies, Japanese companies, Chinese companies could be involved in some reconstruction of North Korea, which really as a country has not kept up with others in the region and is quite backward in terms of simple GDP per head mechanics.
There are obviously trade benefits to all of this between North and South. Talk about some of that.
Yeah, sure. So North Korea, you've got to be mindful in terms of the size of the economy. If you go back to the late 1970s, I think GDP per head in South Korea was at parity with North Korea. Now that's just no longer the case. North Korea as an opportunity, there were 25 million people there, so there's a sizable population, and that population could be engaged as a labour force involved in areas like textiles, for example, and getting opportunities which are currently in place in some of the ASEAN countries such as Vietnam or Myanmar. So potentially there is an opportunity for South Korean capital to merge with relatively inexpensive North Korean labour and combine in certain areas of low-cost manufacturing. That's where perhaps the opportunity is.
Jim McCafferty in Hong Kong, thanks for being with us.
Pleasure.
Still to come on Counting the Cost, a question of copyright, why artists in South Sudan are struggling to benefit from their work. But first, thousands of survivors of a massive earthquake in Nepal 3 years ago are still living in makeshift shelters. They say the government has not lived up to its promise to provide them with permanent homes. Sabina Shrestha reports.
From the air, Baskarka village looks like any other. But all these huts have flimsy walls made of tarpaulin sheets and bamboo. When the magnitude 7.8 earthquake shook this part of the world 3 years ago, 9,000 people died. Almost 4,000 of them were from Sindhipalchok district. 152 families took shelter on this hilltop. Maya Dong's village is a day's walk from here.
Our house was swallowed by the river. Here it's impossible to sit inside during the summer. In the winter it's cold and damp, and when the wind blows we are sometimes afraid that our roof might get blown off.
Almost 800,000 homes were damaged by the quake. Each family qualifies to receive $3,000 for rebuilding. But so far only 119,000 families have a permanent home. The rest remain in temporary shelters. Maya Dong's family are qualified for the grant, except they have nowhere to build because experts say their villages are unsafe.
Geologists have identified more than 80 families here who can no longer return to their villages. The government has said that they are going to resettle them, but the process is extremely long as the decision to allocate land has to be made by the cabinet.
Across the country, 286 areas are identified as high-risk zones for quake damage. Around 4,000 families need permanent relocation. They are frustrated with the delays, and so are their government representatives.
We've been elected for just around a year, and we've processed all the documents necessary for this area. The problem is the country's system runs very slow.
The government estimates $10 billion will be needed to rebuild the country. Months after the quake, donors had pledged $4 billion for reconstruction, but the government says that the money has not been handed over yet.
Of the pledge amount, we already have agreements for $2.6 billion. We're not in a position to say that there's a budget crunch and we can't give any help. We're committed to rebuilding as soon as possible.
Local government leaders want to build a model village here. But for Nepalis living under these sheets, they just hope that by next winter, walls will protect them from the wind and rain.
All right, the World Economic Forum is predicting that machines will replace a fifth of all human jobs over the next 20 years. Divya Gopalan went to a learning center in Hong Kong, teaching kids to stay ahead of robots.
These children are preparing for what's being called the fourth industrial revolution. They're learning how to embrace a future where advanced robotics and artificial intelligence, or AI, will be part of everyday life.
I did the chip and then my sister did the computer. You need to plug it into the other robot system to make it work.
It may look like fun and games, but under the guidance of professionals and experts in engineering and technology, in this robotics class, they're learning how to make machines think for themselves. This experimental learning lab was conceived by the tech entrepreneur and CEO of Outblaze, a company specializing in digital media, games, apps, and innovation.
All the stuff at present already, a machine can do much better. There's no way that you can compete with that. What we really need to prepare our next generation is for skills that a machine cannot do that well. Right? That's how we stay relevant and competitive in the future. But right now, schools don't do that.
The World Economic Forum reports a fifth of the global workforce may lose their jobs to automation in the next 2 decades. The Hong Kong government recognizes the city needs to keep up with the developments in technology.
This year, the government is investing around $6.5 billion in science and innovation. Most of those funds will be going to research and development, industries, and science and tech parks like this one. Many people want to know why that push for innovation isn't extending into the classrooms to reach the generation that will be most affected by changes in technology.
My understanding of the groups that are meeting now under the auspices of the Chief Executive are tinkering with the curriculum. They're looking at how Chinese history might be inserted into the curriculum. They're looking at how patriotic education might be a better part of the curriculum.
For now, it's up to private initiatives to help children keep up with the changes in technology.
Making the robot, and we will set the name in the computer, and we will done it and draw it and have the competition.
How did your robot do in the competition?
We won.
But that won't be the case for the majority of Hong Kong's children. Experts say unless there are radical changes in the formal schooling system, the next generation is likely to lose in the competition against machines.
Well, it looks like the recent scandals over data privacy haven't put a dent in the earnings of the world's biggest tech companies. The latest numbers from Facebook also showed advertisers continue to favor the platform, with ad spending actually increasing. Revenue soared 50% to almost $12 billion in the first 3 months of the year. The #1 digital publisher, Google, continued to generate growth in advertising revenues, ad sales leaping nearly 24% from a year ago to $26.6 billion in the first quarter. And finally, writers and musicians in South Sudan are struggling with the absence of copyright laws in the country, and that's forced many to produce their material abroad. Hiba Morgan reports from Juba.
It takes days, sometimes weeks, for one of South Sudan's most popular musicians, Emmanuel Kembe, to write, record, and produce his songs. Yet despite his dedication, he benefits very little from the finished product.
In South Sudan, basically, copyright law is not exist. So we musicians, we spend time, money, energy to produce, but there's no any law that protects our rights. Like in other countries, even the neighboring countries like Sudan, Uganda, so like when musicians produce music, at least they earn something out of their work.
Emmanuel is one of more than 50 artists in South Sudan, all facing the same problem. Musicians, writers, and poets are all suffering because there are no laws in place to protect their work. Now, many prefer to have their work produced in other countries where there is copyright legislation.
We're in South Sudan, and South Sudan doesn't actually have a copyright society or copyright system here. I wanted to try to publish in Uganda. I would publish them in Uganda, definitely. Yeah, but I would still maintain that identity of a South Sudanese poet who's publishing in Uganda.
There are no distribution companies in South Sudan. It's not seen as a worthwhile investment. But that doesn't mean artists' works are not being sold.
Distributing the work of artists without their permission isn't difficult. You bring a stick or drive to a music seller here in the market and choose the music you want. He'll copy it and you'll pay, and it will cost less than $1. Then you can reproduce songs using the music and the lyrics, and the artists don't even know that their music is being sold on.
Government has taken little interest in the arts and literature sector, especially after a civil war broke out in 2013. Tens of thousands of people have been killed and a third of the country's 12 million population displaced. But the government says it is now working on a bill and forming a council to protect the intellectual property of artists.
Council will be formed soon by the approval of the cabinet, so that it will become umbrella. And then at the same time, we'll confirm that we have a body that we can give him. We can give this body a policy. We can this body laws, so that we talked about protection.
For Emmanuel and other artists, this provides some hope that in the future, it is they who will benefit financially from their words and music, not an unknown third party.
And that is our show for this week. Remember, you can get in touch with us by tweeting me at @HazemSeeker and use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online as well at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our webpage, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Hazem Seeker from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.